Peter, great seeing you, my friend.
Yeah.
It's been quite
Really
a
good to
while.
see
We
you.
finally get together post-pandemic and excited to be seeing you, working with you again. And if you would, introduce yourself and a little bit about Vemo.
Okay, great. I'm Peter Louch. I'm the CEO of Vemo, and it's great to be with you here. I remember when you were first getting started in this with less setup,
Yeah.
with a little phone, maybe a toy mic, things like that.
In Las Vegas or
in
South
Las Vegas,
Yeah, that's
on the
right.
spur of the side,
That's
it's
right.
weird, people walk by.
And just so
One of
you
these.
know, we have multiple cameras. We got lights all over the place.
Yeah, all happening now.
So
It's really
thank
good.
you for remembering. Yeah.
But yeah, so we're trying to get back to normal a little bit, I think, here.
Yeah.
And just get the word out on the things we've been doing for a long time. But Vemo is a workforce planning and people analytics company really focused on the practical and really focused on predictive analytics. We've been doing this for quite some time, work with very large companies who are very interested in being successful with this. And that's, yeah.
And you have been, and this is the thing about the space, and I'd love your perspective because we're going to talk about your view on people analytics and workforce planning. We'll talk a little bit about Vemo itself, but here's the thing that you have a unique perspective on, at least that I see, is that you've seen how this space has evolved over the past 20 years. You've worked with CHROs, you've worked with companies that have been in transition through a few downturns, and here we are at the beginning of 2023. There's stress on the economy. Workforce planning is happening in some organizations, and I would place bets on those companies to endure successfully long term, whereas others are taking the old financial hatchet approach and they do not know what skills they're losing. They're not being very planful, at least from my perspective. So with that as the staging, what is workforce planning to you here in 2023, and how does that relate to what you've seen in the past?
Yeah, with workforce planning, the thing is that it's that thing that everybody does to some degree or another in an organization. They might do it in a collective, organized way, which is super helpful for the organization, or they might do it in a very disorganized way. People are always planning. And the difference is that if you are doing it well, you're not as afraid of all these changes. And if you're not doing it, you're just growing because everyone else is growing and only doing things because that's what the market says and shareholders say you should do, and doing everything just to maximize shareholder profit all the time, you might miss the ball in terms of the long term. Now, some of the companies that are doing the big cuts right now are the ones that have the huge market caps. So they have some room for error. So it's debatable about whether, there's always exceptions, right? It's debatable about whether it applies to everybody, but most organizations really have to think carefully about the talent they need. They have to think careful about the skills that they need. And if they can do it in a somewhat advanced manner, you could go 5 years, you could go 3 months, you actually are going to treat your people better because you're going to have a better knowledge about what's happening.
Yeah, and this is where I get fired up because taking off of what you just shared, this is a leader decision whether or not to do it or not to do it. And it affects people's lives. It not only affects business continuity and the ability to innovate downstream and sustain customer satisfaction and innovation over the near term, but people are affected by this. Not only the people that are potentially let go, but the people who stay. There's heightened anxiety and there's research that shows this. So in terms of workforce planning, again, here in the modern times, because we can, over our discussion, we can draw comparisons to the past. What is the process by which it enters? In other words, who's in the room? Historically, it's been HR doing this over here, and then finance and IT have been doing this over here. What does it look like to you if a company is actually doing workforce planning?
Yeah, if you're doing it well, the leaders, the managers, whatever you want to call those, are doing it across the organization. There's a lot of participants. HR and finance need to work together to set it up. Particularly HR. Finance has processes around budgets and things like that. They would like them to be better informed and more drilled down to that role and skill level. But it's maybe too much. It's not really their area to focus on. HR needs to really set it up and set the criteria and really the things about people talent that managers don't necessarily think about, because I've always called the 1 in 20 rule. There's that one manager who just really understands people understands how to motivate people, understands finance, understands what kind of jobs and skills are necessary, just knows at the back of their hand. And then everyone starts thinking about that archetype. That's what we have here
Yep.
at XYZ Corporation.
Yep.
But there's the other 19, there might be 2 who just can't do it. There might be 5 who are new to their roles and actually learning and not doing this. So HR needs to set the scope so that everyone can do those things.
I love what you're saying, and just to level set here, we'll talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, talent acquisition, talent development, learning, internal mobility. All this stuff relates to workforce planning.
Yeah.
It just has not been positioned in some cases with this broader view. So what I hear you saying, leaders need to work together to understand the trade-offs of laying people off potentially, reorgs, and on down the line. But historically, in many organizations, it just hasn't happened in a very systematic, disciplined way. To reframe the question that I just posed, why don't you think that's happening? Or is it?
I think it's happening. I think it happens a lot, but
Yeah.
also it doesn't happen a lot.
Yeah. And what are those barriers? What do you think is, in the cases where it's not happening? In organizations mid-size and larger, where you have a workforce that has the ability to morph in various ways, why do you think it's not happening?
I think it's, all right, so we're sitting, both of us, in this realm of human resources, consulting, software, technology, and all that. So what I would say is that organizations are doing this to some degree or another. A lot of times when human resources is involved, there is a lot of intense analytics involved. There's concern about it being like an HR program that you have to perfect in the HR factory. Maybe HR starts off by saying, you know what, let's do a pilot on HR. Really not that helpful.
Yeah.
Really not that at all. Yeah, it's good, but you're not going to motivate. It's not the same as what the business is doing overall for the lion's share of the business. So I think what happens is that then if you don't have that partnership with the business to bring it and have business managers doing this work under an organized schema, then what happens is there's the appearance like it's not really happening, but it is happening. It's just not happening in an organized way. It's not happening as helpful a way as possible. I just want to go back to one thing, which is sometimes I am a famous oversimplifier. So sometimes people say, what's workforce planning? People ask me, I say, it's all about better managing attrition. It's so basic, but if you know what you need with some period ahead of time, and you know roughly how many people you're going to lose, you can actually decide when people leave, do we replace them or not? Mm-hmm. It's so basic, but it really leads to these advantages. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about that in the context of your organization about how do you make the world better in a way with something. So a lot of times people think workforce planning, they ask, are you like the Bob and the Bobs or whatever? What's that? Yeah. Are you just a restructuring expert? Yeah. But really, we're trying to convince people that if you do this work, that you will actually know what you need, you'll be able to be proactive, and you'll be able to not replace certain jobs when they leave, replace other jobs that you need more quickly in pipeline, have more of the talent you need without actually hurting your people at all.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for saying that. Let's spend some time taking off what you just shared and define workforce planning a bit more. And I want to stage it a little bit, and I'll show my bias. Like, I don't care for the term strategic workforce planning, because workforce planning by its very nature is not only strategic and far-reaching, it's also relevant to the here and now with decisions we make. So it's been pushed off into the esoteric when you talk like about naming conventions and what are we actually doing. At the end of the day, and I'm going to set this up with an anecdote. I had the great pleasure of working with Walt Disney Animation Studios years ago. It's over, 12 years ago, give or take. And Wreck-It Ralph was in production, Frozen was right behind that, Big Hero 6 was right behind that. And at that time, or just before, Disney had purchased Pixar. And Pixar's leadership came over to Walt Disney Animation Studios. They had a mandate to release one feature film every 12 months. Instead of what they formerly had done is release one feature film every 24 months. And the artists were now becoming part of the studio, whereas before they were becoming part of a project. And once their role in that project or that film would be done, then they would be out on the street looking for their next gig. So now they're part of the studio. And so the ability to move someone, once their role in a certain project was done or film, to another place where their skills and abilities was necessary, you can imagine, how to do that at scale, at speed. And they were fantastic at it relative to most others because they had a systematic way of thinking about it. Now, I don't want to make an illusion that it was perfect, but I will say this, is that when we first started to have workforce planning meetings there, no one wanted to talk about workforce planning, and I say that compassionately. They were pretty much saying, hey, sounds great, but I need to get something done right here, right now. And I'm going to use my own language for a second. What they were really interested is what I would call talent deployment. They wanted, okay, who's going to be available within the next week or two so I can get this done? And once you tell me that, then I can talk about the strategy for the next 6 to 12 months in terms of hiring strategy, contingent labor, org design, all this other stuff. And then there was yet something else called workforce visioning. So they're looking 3 to 5 years out. What are the disruptors in the marketplace? So for me, those 3 buckets, if you will, are all workforce planning, right. And we needed to get on the same page in terms of our language. So with that as the staging, does that resonate with you, and how would you define workforce planning beyond what you shared?
Yeah, first I'd say if you want the talent in the grocery store, you have to have the supply chain, right? You have to have all the people.
Yeah, absolutely.
You have to know the Fast 50. You have to know all those things, right?
Yeah.
In order to do that. So broadly, this will take just a couple minutes, but broadly, the way that I'm viewing this right now is that people spend a lot of time with data collection. So workforce planning to me is if you can start with the prediction of what you're most likely to do. And I say this a lot of times, I'm not sure whether people just yes me or whether they actually agree with this, but I think organizations are cultures. They're like large cultures that behave in certain ways. They're economically constrained by what business they're in. They're risk constrained by what talent they have to, like, so with Pixar, Walt Disney, there's certain roles that if they don't have them, they'll not hit the 24-month schedule, let alone the 12-month schedule. So they have those constraints. They also just have certain sort of cultures around the competition and what they do, which leads to certain behaviors, sure. Which are like, yeah, we're going to pipeline hire certain numbers of jobs. We're not going to hire other jobs until people leave. We're going to be really constrained in these areas. We're going to be really generous in these areas, et cetera. So that leads to like this machinery that just goes on, which ends up being very predictable. It doesn't mean it's what a company should do. It means what they most likely will do. So through data now, and data collection is, from all the time we've been working together, it's just better and better. Yep. It's much easier to use machine learning to really predict what is a company likely to do. Yeah. So if you can start with the manager and say, this is what you're very likely to do you have anything that's wrong about where you're headed normally? Is your business changing? Do you have new competition? Are you facing new risks? Are there new opportunities you're not capturing? You can then say, no, great, let's just use the data. Let's move on, let's do the 80% rule on that. Let's find that 20% to go forward. And then workforce planning emerges out to be a lot of this gap closure, the talent deployment. It's squishy, right? Because the problem with, I've always joked, hey, this workforce planning initiative is actually not going to cure all of your problems, right? It can't be everything you don't solve through some other technology, et cetera. It's not going to pick up your dry cleaning. Right. Not that you have it anymore, but whatever. So it's not going to do all those things. But it does extend into that gap closing area. It does extend into these other initiatives like diversity and inclusion that you mentioned as well.
I want to talk about the initiatives this affects beyond just workforce planning itself and diversity, equity, inclusion, talent acquisition, which you mentioned as well. But before I do, and I also want to talk about the data. Right. How do you prioritize the data and the relationship between workforce planning and analytics? But there is one thing that before we go forward that I believe is critical for anyone listening and understanding or wanting to understand how to bring workforce planning to life in their organizations. And it's this, is that if we get IT, finance, HR in the room, at what frequency do we do this? And to your point, I have a prediction. I have a certain thought of how the business is going to go. based on the market, based on our ability to innovate and respond to market needs. So if we're a fast-growing company, we're probably going to do a lot of hiring, and we might have to gain some efficiencies and economies of scale. If it's a tight market, then we might have to constrict or want to stay the status quo for a certain time and do a hiring freeze. Yeah. So there's a certain level of, again, say 10 people are in the room, all 10 people have their ideas of what the future is going to look like. Right. Oftentimes, those ideas stay in their heads and they're not brought together to increase the likelihood, hopefully, of what will actually happen, and based on certain scenarios that they can adjust. So this is all based on what you shared. Have a prediction, have a idea of what that future, and you can always adjust, but if you don't have that idea, you're just, even talking about it creates some anxiety for me. And that anxiety could be at scale, and to your point too, that in turn could affect the culture. Because now, oh gosh, leaders don't really know what they're doing. You can feel the chaos and so forth. So again, the frequency of that group getting together and harnessing the wisdom of the group to better understand what will likely happen in the future. What do you think the frequency looks like?
Yeah, I was thinking briefly about what you said. You don't like the term strategic workforce planning. And I've had an annoying boss myself for a long time. But last time I had a boss, I had this boss, Ed Piccolino. He was the former head of HR at Pepsi International, I think MGM Records as well. Master of all the great sayings. And he used to always say, and I think he got this from some other book, but he talked about, are we talking strategy with a big S or strategy with a small s here? And I think that I don't like you, I don't the big S, strategic workforce planning, but the small s is pretty good. This is an area that I think that we've created a lot of success for our customers, where they typically will do 2 big S or 3 big S strategic workforce planning initiatives a year. That major recalibration, let's have the big think about what is our need for talent, what are our big risks, et cetera. But then they look at the predictions weekly. And so when you do it weekly, your data is always of more currency than anything that any individual can do. It's just this machinery that's just running, that's constantly saying, hey, it looks like you're gonna have an uptick in this. It looks like you're gonna be hiring a lot more. It looks like, et cetera. And it makes it part of it just makes it kind of part of the way you manage work. It's not really threatening. It's just an extra data voice. You might look and go, oh, it's blips, it's this, it's that, it's whatever. But it just makes it part of, hey, this is part of our weekly staff meeting because we have new data. Let's just take a look. Is there anything interesting? Let's look at this element, et cetera. Yeah. So I think that those conversations where people get in a room and really think about it and try to challenge, like workforce planning, it's not like succession planning they used to talk about. Let's have these challenge meetings. Like you'll say, I want to promote everybody. They're all top talent. No, they're not. And then you go back and forth in that. So I think the challenge meetings are the big strategic workforce planning that happens several times a year. Maybe you try to do it quarterly, but you're always going to miss one quarter probably because something else is happening, where you really challenge your assumptions and really try to dig deep. Then I think that you allow this data just to flow and really provide information, and that just helps people a lot because they can say, hey, it looks like we're suddenly going to be recruiting a lot more of X. Yeah. It looks like this is heading in the wrong direction or the right direction, et cetera.
Yeah, just to emphasize a point, what I'm hearing you say, and again, from my vantage point, it's so right, is it's iterative. It's not like you have a plan and you're high-fiving each other because the plan was 95% accurate or something like that. It's, hey, we have a plan, we know where we're going, we're going to adjust based on new data that comes in. It could be internal data, it could be external data. We're just going to be more confident as we move forward. And one of the things, and I really want to go to the data, but I'm tempted to stay on the more process view first, because many organizations of any size have quarterly business reviews, QBRs. And so it's long been a question of mine, and I call it a QREP, a quarterly workforce review and plan. So why don't organizations have the same discipline around workforce planning as they do around QBRs? In the ideal future state, would you see there be really close alignment between the two?
Yeah. I actually think most of our clients have a QBR-like process where either it's the planning, or we also do a lot of work in people analytics where they're bringing that information to those meetings. Fortunately and unfortunately, I've done this for a long time to see a lot of things happening, and sometimes it's frustrating because you see problems that you solved 15 years ago or 20 years ago, you see them still happening to companies. And you're like, why?
Yeah.
Like, why?
Yeah.
One of the chief human resource officers I work with once said, hey, it used to be the HR interlude at the strategy meeting. Now we have the HR hour. Now we have the HR day out of 3 days. And now they're like, let's forget the rest of the strategy stuff. Our business is not changing that much. Let's just talk about the talent. And that's, I think, there is a balance between that's a little bit facetious. But I think it should be part of whatever your review is. Like what? Like you wouldn't, oh, how did I run out of money? I still have checks. You know what I mean? And it's kind of thing. It's like you have to always be thinking about the talent implications.
Yeah.
Because most businesses are all about the talent.
And what I find great joy in is a lot of workforce planning is turning into, for lack of a better way to term it, total company workforce planning,
Yeah.
as opposed to just the top 100 or where it was really succession planning. And the implication was everybody else underneath that, so to speak, is interchangeable and they're just talent flying around everywhere. But the leaders have woken up and said, hey, there are great people throughout the organization, from individual contributors to new hires who've been here 3 months. And if we spend all this time, money, and effort to hire them in the first place, we should be working our tails off to not only retain them, but create an environment where they can thrive.
Yeah.
So that as a stage, I want to ask, do you believe workforce planning, quote unquote, can be done at a group or function level, like a subset of an organization? Or do you think it should be done company-wide right from the outset?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people peddle this conversation, which is if it sounds too good to be true, it's too good to be true. Just focus on these 3 roles. You know what I mean? So then you're like, hey, let's focus on our engineers, but we're building planes. The plane has to take off, right? It has to fly. It has to last X thousand miles, all those things like that. So I think that it's convenient. So a lot of people will say, don't worry about this, you can do it too. You know, they try to minimize the amount of work. And I would say, let's not minimize the amount of work. This is just shifting your work. You spend so much time working on talent in your organization. Let's shift your work to be more principled in how we do this work. Let's do it company-wide. And I think that with the changes, I think that people are still saying that, but I don't think leaders believe that at all. Because I think they know we're resource constrained. We're implementing a lot of technologies which are changing our need for people. But we have shortages for these top jobs that don't seem to be like very easy to close ever. We have a lot of jobs we just can't recruit for. They're so specialized that we need to really grow. And we need to make more use of the people we have. And if we don't make more use of the people we have, it's really easy to leave. Yeah. We've had a lot of customers who have said, hey, guess what? We're no longer going to do this work from home thing where we're coming back to the office. And then one of my customers said it was like there's pitchforks in the halls. Sorry about it. It was really bad, really bad. So I think what it is that this is I think there is a bit of a new reality. It's compensation. You can't say, you know what, we realized that our comp ratio, our approach to market was bad all along. We're just going to pay all of you less, but it's okay because you're not going to really earn less than market. Everyone will leave. Yep. So I think once people have this concept of like, hey, it's more fluid, and there's this more control, and it's also like the emperor has no clothes type of thing. It's like people know, hey, I was really effective. I got more done. It suited me better. It made me want to stay at this company for longer. Absolutely. All those changes mean, all right, so it's more competitive than ever, and you need to do better work moving your people around, giving them more experiences. Yep. The old saying, you give people enough skills to be able to leave, but then they don't want to leave because they know they're going to get those skills from you. Yeah, 100%. And what you're sharing is making me realize and think about the fact that workforce planning has been paralyzed because what leaders believe the process is and what it can and cannot do, and as important as anything, the work it would take to actually do it effectively. Me at this stage of my career, and we're of similar age, we've been at this 20 plus years, and when we first started, it was largely spreadsheets or access databases or SQL. It was very labor intensive. Right. You had to manually stage data, and you had to understand scenarios based on algorithms that you would write within
spreadsheet. That, as absurd as it sounds this day and age, but the amount of work involved is now a lot less. There are efficiencies, there's different ways that we can look at things and do scenario planning and predictions and things that were formerly heavy lifting. So I say this because if we're going to benefit the workers in the way that you're talking about, particularly, let's say with mergers and acquisitions. So there's two organizations, they have two different databases, they're looking at talent different ways. If there's a solution like yours brought to the fore, you can actually look at both views, have some logic that brings them together, and now leaders can make conscious decisions on how to reorg in a healthy way that inspires confidence, as opposed to throw stuff against the wall and make it, hope it works out. Can you speak to workforce planning's role in M&A and the efficiencies that we've gained over the past 20 years?
Yeah, M&A is a challenging area because you're not allowed to share this information ahead of time. So your time frame is really condensed. People, the day it closes, there's already been a commitment for the dollar saved, for the headcount cut, other things like that. But it does remind me that I did work in a line manager job in a company that did a lot of M&A before. And I was given targets like, hey, you have to cut half of this the day you walk in, like ridiculous things. But it was always like these weird numbers that were already like pre-inflated, like half the people were already gone or whatever, things like that. But I really think that you see so much failure in M&A, you see some bold successes as well, that if organizations took their approach of better planning, of actually understanding what they had, of creating like equitable opportunities on both sides of the fence, bringing them together, being more planful, being willing to maybe carry a little bit more talent, it would really benefit them. Yep. Because a lot of companies say, hey, we wiped out 2 years of value through this M&A that didn't really work, and things like that. So I think it's like, I would not claim at all to really have solved this problem because there's so many externalities with it. Yeah. But I think it could be like such a great mindset around, hey, we're gonna do M&As with the workforce planning sort of heavy context around it and do this work, and we don't have enough time, so let's do some shortcuts to make this better. Yep. And looking that way.
Yeah, and that's actually a good segue into the conversation that I've been putting off, and that's around people analytics relationship to workforce planning. And I also want to talk about talent intelligence and labor market analytics and how that plays into workforce planning. But before we go there, people analytics, which is not to be esoteric and talk about predictions and all that all day, but just the basic data elements that we're talking about. What do you see is necessary? What's the core data that you're using to facilitate workforce planning?
Oh, sure. The good news is that you have the experience, and I know you in stats and things like that. Yeah. So the thing about stats is that there's a core amount of data necessary to do the heavy lifting of anything. And then there's also a lot of window dressing that people enjoy a lot. So you have to decide, am I creating something for enjoyment, or am I creating something to do the heavy lifting? You also have to decide, am I trying to segment, or am I trying to predict? Because segmenting your population for like high turnover risk is a completely different exercise than it is to predict how many people are going to leave. And actually, we have a YouTube channel that my colleague Chris Reese has put together that gets really into this. And this is one of his key passions of make sure you use the right tools, but it's very accessible. And we've had a couple of clients who've actually viewed these and are saying, we want everyone in HR to watch this so we can be more experienced in this. So that's a huge success. And that's what we want to do. At this point, we want to share this knowledge and educate. So nice. I hope people who see this podcast go on and look at that. So.
Absolutely. We'll make sure we put it in the comments, because that's what the micro learning around this, not to get distracted by that theme, I think is really important, but it's also difficult, because if I'm a practitioner, HR leader, or someone in talent acquisition or workforce planning, it's my organization's different. That's not how we function. That being said, there are emerging what I would call salient truths, might be a stretch, but ways of doing things that are emerging as leading practices that will mitigate risk and get you in an improved way and heightened confidence, as opposed to just making it up. Because I see too many leaders just balking because we're not there yet. And we've been hearing that 20 plus years. So going back to the data and the analytics, and let me start here before we get into actual metrics and things like that. What is the relationship between workforce planning professionals and people analytics professionals? Should they be one and the same? Because workforce planners historically have lived in talent acquisition, and it has been mostly around who we should be hiring over what period of time, where our location or our recruiting strategy should focus, and all that. And it has taken a less view, in my experience, around internal mobility and org design. But I think you'll agree, based on our discussions to date, that it's all of that. And we haven't done a great job in many organizations of really looking systematically. So the pointed question is, again, what's the relationship between workforce planning and people analytics professionals in the ideal future state that you see?
I've been accused a lot of times of being like, Peter, are you trying to trick us with workforce planning to bring back OE? Type of thing, which is not a bad thing to be accused of, actually. But so one observation I've had is a lot of our customers who have been most successful launching their efforts have actually not come from talent acquisition, but have had a hybrid finance and HR background. They've done stints in both. They've worked on cost control programs. They've worked on those things, and they've also worked in terms of sort of talent management in areas like that. It does seem that the people who focus on workforce planning, we're an odd group. So I think there's a specialty around it that's different. It's like it's something to itself. We do try to support customers who have to moonlight as workforce planners while they also do other things. The people analytics, that's a tough question. There's a lot of people analytics which are backwards looking. And there's an inherent desire to look back constantly at your turnover, your mobility, your different things, but not through the lens of statistics. So I think my personal feeling is that the forward-looking ones are more important because you actually can't do anything. You can't remake this past, but you can know where you're heading and do more with it. So I think in an ideal world, they're very joined, but sometimes with workforce planning, you get assigned key outputs, which are really important, that you have to focus on where. So if you can bring it all together, perfect. But if you can't, then I think there are elements where you just have a Venn diagram.
You have a relationship, letting each other know what you're doing and help set priorities for one another. Because I agree with you, people analytics historically has been looking backwards and looking at what is the next best action, but what are the repercussions of that downstream has not always been within their sphere of visibility or influence. And that's where workforce planning comes in, because that is around scenario planning, that is looking forward. And yes, we can, and I'm refraining from asking this question, is it 2 years, is it 5 years? And because it obviously depends. And if we don't agree on that, then it might be on the wrong podcast.
It depends. I solely agree with you. It really depends.
It absolutely depends, right? So I want to talk about quickly talent intelligence and labor market analytics, because that is getting a lot of play. There are new vendors into the space. It seems like more every day because there's data in the public domain. Not many people know this because not many people knew from the beginning, but HiQ was purchased. Let me just fast forward. They sued Microsoft, and they actually won because Microsoft had purchased LinkedIn, and there was a whole to-do about that.
I remember that,
But the outcome of that is that the data that's on LinkedIn is effectively there for the taking. Now, I'm overstating it, but we all know that data, among other data that relates to people's profiles, is now being consumed by a variety of vendors, and that's creating visibility into where talent are, what they're doing in terms of jobs. And so at the end of the day, there's a lot more insight into the external talent market. And if we can better understand where we are going with our organization, then we can prioritize not only where we recruit, but where we relocate our businesses and how we flex and move over time. So if workforce planning now in 2023 and beyond, how would you advise workforce planners thus to absorb that type of data relative to the data that they're already consuming from their people analyst colleagues and from the data that they're accessing themselves.
Yeah, I think that you know me for a while, and even from this conversation, you can tell I'm really into the process.
Yeah. Likewise, just for the record. Yeah.
So I feel that this is a journey we're very much on with our customers right now as it evolves. And so just like from a snippet of it, we've had customers talking to us for years about skills. And at first I think we were fresh with them, or we're just like, all right, show us your skills. Okay, you can't show us them, forget it. We're not putting it on the roadmap, whatever. And then we thought it's really coming of a time where there is this concept of role-based versus skill-based. Yeah, there's all these semantics problems, and half the time people say roles, they mean skills, and vice versa. And it's hard to know what people mean. So we said, let's develop a viewpoint of what we mean. You know, that you're gonna plan by these job roles. They're very well defined. We're gonna accept that compensation typically sets these job roles in your company. And that every person might have end skills, and every job might have end skills. And so also in the last several years, in addition to the longer term workforce planning, we've developed a shorter term resource management module that helps organizations that are matrixed figure out like what are their assignments for future work, what types of skills do people need. So we now actually are a creator of skills data as well. And we're able, and we have access to the same type of scrape data. So we're able to say, what does the scrape data say? And then what does this other data say that's coming from, and we're like, okay, this is not good. This is like a 2% crossover, right?
Yeah.
So there's this really Tower of Babel kind of thing happening with this, right? But I think what it is that you can start morphing this data and organizing in such a way that perhaps you could really understand what are these true gaps and where are these hidden skills that we really need. And I think part of the external market providers is that they've done this really tough work on taxonomies and ontologies and this type of work where perhaps those can be leveraged by an organization to better bring these points together and move that, okay, it's not really a 2% gap, it's really only 50. What areas does it matter and things like that? Yeah. So our viewpoint now is that as you can tell, we're starting off our customers with a predictive model of their demand, attrition, their mobility, their diversity. We're also matrixing that skill view and saying, by the way, we think you're gonna be really short of these types of engineers or these types of nurses or these type of line workers, et cetera, with these types of skills underneath to create just that initial thinking. Like sometimes it's okay to be wrong in your first guess on some things, but just to actually ask, are we really? Do we think it's gonna be that? Then that starts putting the energy around how do we get this kind of cleaned up in a way that we can really use it on an ongoing basis.
I love what you're sharing because to our earlier point, the point that you made earlier, is that if you have a plan, then you can deviate from that plan. You can test some of the underlying assumptions, and you can get aligned on those assumptions with a governance body, so you can understand the trade-offs and the risks and so forth. So what you were sharing invites the question, Vemo. We're going to talk in another forum about your personal story, so check back for that. But for now, why would someone work with Vemo? And to put that question in another way, what's the ideal use case? Because we've talked about talent intelligence, we've talked about people analytics, we've talked about workforce planning. And there's increasing energy around these themes, which is fantastic, particularly even in the downturn in the economy. There is the need for this work, in my view, and I think you'll agree, it's going to be forever more. This is just the way we do things, and there's now story after story about organizations that have outperformed those who have done people analytics and workforce planning relative to those who have not, and that's, of course.
Yeah.
So why would an organization, again, adopt Vemo? Or again, to reframe it, what's the ideal scenario where you all come in and add value over the near term?
Yeah, I think that, I guess it could be a little bit cliche, but I think that the companies who use us outperform in these types of metrics. It's not going to do everything for a company, but it's going to definitely help with the talent side a lot in terms of what's needed, what the gaps are. And we don't expect customers to have the best organized, greatest data. We're not looking to sell 1 million copies where it's like, hey, if you get your data and you spend all this time internally getting it perfect in our format, you can feed it. What we do is we have this really incredible experience in data mining and morphing, sometimes I call it the organizational debris, into this really useful outcomes that allow them to really understand their future workforce. And I feel like we can go with a company who doesn't even do people analytics, and we can get them what other companies take like 10 years to do, we can get them there in a year. We can be like, you can be fully using people analytics within 6 months, and you can be doing workforce planning in a year. And there's so many companies that you hear of, right? What happened to that initiative? We're waiting, and we're trying to perfect it, and we're confused about what this is. We're really like results driven, really practical. We're impatient with ourselves around it. We're not impatient with our customers, but we really try to figure out, how do we make this happen?
Yeah, and to your earlier point, you're not only providing the tech, you are very process oriented, so you're helping stand up and facilitate these processes. Is that right?
Yeah, we are. We're very free with our advice in the process. I used to joke around always that I'm a reform consultant selling technology, but in many ways, we're not trying to withhold the advice as a separate stream or separate services. We're embedding it, like most of our customers. When we first started, we partnered with Brass Ring before all the different versions and sold, and they had this named account manager model, which their customers like loved. And they had a lot of the biggest companies, and I thought that was a great model. And I knew their leadership a lot and kind of looked at it and learned about it and thought that's a great way to structure a company. To have this named account manager model where you actually have an expert who you work with who talks to you like weekly. And if that's too often, then maybe not as often, but you're always thinking about it, pointing things out to them and moving that. And so that's what we do, which really, it's a real powerful accelerant to doing this. And then the other thing is that we have a point of view that you should get this launched to the business. You should get business users. Once it takes off, it really, people rely on it. So we have customers who we have over 1,000 people a week accessing this information in some way at a customer. And once you're at that point, you're really just embedded in how they do business. And that's a good place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good place to be. Yeah. So I have a couple more questions and then we'll wrap, because we spend a day or more talking about this and trying to get ever more granular, and very quickly we'll get to the point where it depends, because each organization is unique. The capability that's being thrown at this is highly variable, both in terms of people and the investment in tech. But to do this in the absence of tech or the right people, who know what workforce planning is, or at least open to learning and creating, because it's not that you just pull a guide and just go do it, because it is a very creative, iterative process, again, as we talked about. So DEI and employee well-being, we touched on it earlier, in cultures of inclusion. The idea that we can do that work in the absence of measures and monitoring over time, I think is illusionary. We need something beyond programs to understand whether or not we're getting where we want to go. And oftentimes organizations don't know what their ideal future state is, or what the level of improvement can or should be over a certain period of time. And I don't expect you to have the answer. What my question is the need for data, number one, and if there are any metrics that have emerged for you, what pops?
Yeah, this is the area that we've thought a lot, because in essence, sometimes we feel like we have to be the bad news people for this. We have these predictions. We can help organizations predict how diverse they will be from their plans and also from our predictions, and it's never their target. And there's this thing that's like, hey, we're doing this. I can't think how many times we're doing so well in recruiting, but they're not thinking about these certain grades, levels, bands, managerial levels, which are what people are really, which are where they have the problems as organizations. The big thing we're trying to do is provide this as a standard measurement, which is this is what your future diversity looks like amongst, maybe you're global, it's gender diversity, maybe you're mainly US, it's racial diversity. What will it look like? How does it shred down to core areas of interest that are really important to you? How do you measure it? and how do you see really where you're headed that helps you do a better job setting goals.
Yep.
Because people need to do a better job setting goals. They need to then really get into the hard work of culturally, what are we doing? How are we set up our organization to retain people, et cetera. So I think what we're doing is we're showing the mirror on this. The mirror is not always good, but I think it's an important step of really understanding those data and then deciding what to do. So it's an important area. It's an area that we always try to get everyone to do it. Some people because there's another group that does that's focused on it, or they're concerned because of legal reasons, of it's discoverable information, et cetera, things like that. But more and more organizations do look at it, and it's a great way to look at it and really to see like what is a meaningful target, what is a stretch target.
Yeah. So, given what you're sharing, if I am a head of DI or a head of talent or CHRO listening to this, what would be your advice in terms of measurement and analytics to not even accelerate the program, but just to make sure it's sustainable and hits the mark? Because I don't want to assume that all are bringing measurement to the fore, and I imagine they're trying to do it. However, there's an element, correct me if I'm wrong, if from your thinking, of creativity and I'll say it, courage to look for things that might be uncomfortable. And to your point around discoverability and the need to take action and potential liability there. But if this challenge, this opportunity is going to be met and true change is going to happen, again, if you're talking to a head of DEI, head of talent, CHRO, what would you advise them?
Yeah, back in the good old days when Google used to say, hey, we'll experiment. We're willing to make some mistakes in certain areas we can afford to. This is an area you can't really afford to experiment. So you can't be like, hey, we're going to try this for this part of the company and we're going to do this. We'll measure it, come back in 2 years. Let's see how it all pans out longitudinally. So I think what it is that when in doubt, make things 10% better. So I think what it is that, and also the whole muscle memory, you start doing something you get better at, you start having those conversations. So the fact that you measure it, you have improvements, you have honesty about where you're headed, you say, these are the stretch goals we think we can take, and then you have those town halls, those conversations. How do we actually get here? These are the challenges, this is why we're not getting here. Then you start to make progress, and then that measurement kind of becomes part of your program. I think any company that's committed to measuring in a transparent way and has good logic around what they're doing, I think those companies are most likely going to be more successful with the topic, right, than others.
No, thank you for saying that. Was beautiful, because I see, and frankly, I'm personally frustrated because we've been talking about improving the needle on this for a couple decades, and much longer than that, but really as a focused initiative supporting by data. And it's inviting the question, why have we not progressed more? And so I'm interested in continuing this discussion ongoing. And I love that you called out, just get 10% right at this point. But the idea that the potential liability and risk is a reason not to do anything or not to progress that 10% is just not.
Yeah, you just have to do it right. You can't have a needle and just have shades of different green, yellow, red. You have to actually have numbers.
Yeah.
But you have to on the gauge so you actually know what it is and know where you're heading.
There's so much we can talk about, but as we wrap up, because I mean, there's pay equity, there's obviously recruiting strategy, there's learning strategy, skill development, and I know you play in all those domains, so I just want to call that out. But as we start to wrap, anything else you want to share about Vemo or what coming down the pipe here in 2023 regarding workforce planning or people analytics?
No, I just see that the companies we're working for and with are they're really hitting their stride very quickly in their programs. And I think this is like I actually feel this is one of the tougher areas in technology to be in.
Yes.
Because no one's, hey, you know what, let's not have a recruiting system.
Yeah.
Let's just rip it out, let's do it by paper and fax.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? No one says that, right? So I think people have a lot of different viewpoints, but I really feel that very optimistic that as more and more organizations see companies are very successful with workforce planning, with a very specific viewpoint, have really embedded in their business, it doesn't have to be so shiny anymore. It's something we do that's important. I really think that we're in a really good time for it. And I think for a long period of time in business now, people will feel like there's a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah.
I don't think that anybody is claiming to know the rest of 23, 2024. I think right now it seems like it's a lot of ups and downs. And if you have a lot of ups and downs, you need to be really nimble with your data. You need to have really good processes that help you use that data effectively, get through make decisions more quickly, et cetera. So I think it's just a great time to be in this area. And so it hasn't always been a great time, but hey, when you're in a great time, be in a great time.
I echo what you're sharing. I support what you're sharing. And I just want to highlight that last point is that personally, when I started in this field, I thought, hey, we generate this insight and the whole world would shift.
If you build it, they will come.
And it hasn't happened. So we've been sitting on this insight, yet change hasn't happened in line with that insight. And we have, it's change management, it's influence, it's persuasion, all those things. So in terms of, and this is going to be my last question before we wrap, what do you think leaders specifically, but organizations more broadly, because you mentioned get it in the business, what are they doing to elevate adoption? What are some of the characteristics that you see? Is it just, hey, we have good processes and we have this need and this is information that can be useful? Or was there something, say, a CHRO or somebody else did to say, hey, this is something that we have to do. You have to bring data to this discussion.
Yeah. One of the myths is that CEOs can mandate things and they happen. They can mandate to blue in the face. There's a lot of that feedback that flips back. They think things are happening. So I have seen a number of organizations where the CHRO and CFO have said, we're going to do this. I think that the biggest stumbling block is that people don't get this into the business because they are doing it. And so if you have something which is good enough and really has those benefits, these people are leaders, they're managers, they're directors, they're senior managers for a reason.
Yep.
They're actually good at what they do. If you provide something good to them, they'll use it, and then there will be conflicts, natural. People will want to do different things, but then you'll reach that level. So I think getting this out quickly, under the concept like we're going to be rowing the boat, and we might be rowing in a little bit different directions, but then we'll realize, hey, we don't want to go in circles, right? We want to go towards a destination.
Yeah.
I think that's key. So I do feel that's like an important aspect to it. A lot of we've had companies who've been like, hey, you can't even open a rec unless there's a workforce plan. That's a short-lived initiative.
Yeah.
Someone somewhere calls someone who says what, and then that doesn't happen. So I think it's really about getting it good enough. It's like, it's just working at it, getting that high frequency of really high quality data, not overselling it. I always say, let's not oversell this data. It's really high quality. It tells you a lot of things. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to tell you everything, but it's going to be super frequent. You'll be able to use this data all the time and never have a single doubt that's the most recent data, the best possible prediction for this. That then really takes a lot of work out. There's so much work that's taken out of spreadsheets. There are like millions and millions of dollars saved through a good program.
It's augmented intelligence. We'll use that definition of AI.
Exactly.
As we wrap, how can people learn more about you and Vemo?
People can go to our website, which is Vemo-workforce or vemoworkforce.com. We recently did a big presentation at the Human Capital Institute Virtual Workforce Plan Conference with Lockheed Martin. That's available to download. We have our YouTube channel where my colleague Chris Reese is putting together a series of short explainer videos on predictive modeling. He's doing a piece on turnover, but he's going to follow up with one on mobility, one on skills, and one on diversity and inclusion, which are like the key topics we hit today. Yeah. Not until you mentioned it, but now he is. Just kidding. No, those are our plans. So we have a lot of success doing work in these areas. We want to share some of those key findings and encourage people to really do this work. Yeah. And of course, through your organization, we have a dedicated area. And also we're looking to do a couple events across the country where we hope we can meet people in person.
Well, we'll make it happen. Peter, thank you
Thanks,
for
Al.
sharing.
Great to see you.
Beautiful San Diego
Exactly.
and snow in the mountains there. So,
Exactly.
yeah, no, thanks for sharing. Appreciate you.